It is a familiar end to a long day. The key finally turns, the door opens, and you step into the hallway of a completely empty apartment. But before you even slide your coat off your shoulders, your hand instinctively reaches out to tap a screen or turn on a smart speaker. A podcast begins to play. You aren't actively listening to the words, but the steady hum of human conversation immediately fills the corners of the room. Or perhaps you have observed this in a friend, someone who physically struggles to fall asleep unless an audiobook is murmuring softly on their nightstand. For them, existing in a space devoid of ambient noise is simply not a viable option. This dynamic raises an interesting psychological question. Why does a soundless, empty room feel like a perfect sanctuary to some, while feeling distinctly heavy, almost suffocating to others?
We are often told that the constant stream of audio in modern life is a sign of distraction or a shortened attention span. But looking closer reveals something much deeper. Perhaps the constant need for background noise is not a flaw. Perhaps it is a highly intelligent, deeply adaptive form of emotional regulation. You may have seen someone who finally gets a weekend entirely to themselves. They sit down on the living room sofa, the house completely silent, intending to finally relax. But within 3 minutes, they pick up their phone, illuminate the lock screen to check for notifications that aren't there, set it down, and pick it up again. The sheer lack of sensory input does not make them feel rested. It makes them feel intensely, physically restless. We tend to assume that quiet inherently equals calm. But the nervous system does not simply search for quiet, it searches for predictability. If someone spent years in environments where quiet meant safety, perhaps peaceful homes, predictable routines, their body may eventually associate silence with rest. But imagine another experience, growing up in environments where tension arrived unexpectedly, where conflict happened without warning, where you learned to stay aware. In those environments, complete stillness may not have meant peace. Sometimes quiet came before something, an argument, mood shifts, unpredictability. The body remembers patterns long after situations change. Absolute stillness registers to the brain as a sudden, alarming drop in data. It feels less like peace and more like waiting for the other shoe to drop. For a nervous system trained to always be on guard, the sudden absence of noise creates a spike in vigilance. The discomfort that arises in a quiet room is not a flaw. It is a brilliant protective measure. It is the body saying that silence feels too much like an ambush. Think about the moment you are standing in the kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, slowly folding warm towels from the laundry. You have a television show playing in the background, an episode you have already watched a dozen times. You aren't looking at the screen. You are just tracking the familiar cadence of the dialogue while you smooth out the fabric. This continuous audio stimulation functions as a profound form of unseen emotional scaffolding. It is not about entertainment. A familiar voice looping in the background mimics the biological cues of safe companionship. It softens the sharp edges of isolation, gently occupying the scanning mechanism of a hypervigilant mind. By filling the auditory environment with something entirely predictable, the brain is signaled that the immediate environment is safe. The noise is not there to entertain the mind, it is there to anchor it. There is always that person who seems entirely unbothered by a chaotic, overwhelming environment. If you watch closely, you will notice them easily reading a book or drifting off to sleep in a crowded airport, or in a noisy household where the television has been left running at a high volume since morning. How we interpret sound is heavily shaped by the sensory blueprints drawn in our early environments. If an individual grew up in a household where the television was always blaring, where multiple conversations overlapped in the kitchen, or where keeping track of shifting moods was necessary for survival, the developing brain registers noise as the standard definition of safety. Silence, in stark contrast, becomes a warning sign that something is wrong. Years later, as an adult, unconsciously turning on the radio or a video the exact moment they enter a quiet room is merely the brain brilliantly recreating the sensory atmosphere it recognizes as normal.
They are not running from quiet. They are building the familiar geometry of home. Think about a friend who speaks quickly, moves rapidly, and always seems to be seeking out the next engaging experience. Even when they are simply standing in line at a grocery store, their eyes are scanning the magazine racks, their foot is tapping out a rhythm, and they have one earbud securely in place. Sometimes, the aversion to quiet is heavily influenced by underlying cognitive architecture. Certain minds naturally possess a faster processing speed and a deep neurological craving for novelty and external rewards. For them, a silent room is fundamentally understimulating. It feels like sensory deprivation. The constant layer of sound is an intelligent, practical adaptation to manage the specific way their brain processes reality.
Picture someone getting into their car for a brief 5-minute drive to the corner store. Before they even shift the car into gear, their fingers are frantically scrolling through their phone to find the exact right playlist or podcast, unable to tolerate even the briefest, quietest transit. Any highly effective coping mechanism, when used relentlessly, can eventually harden into a dependency. At what point does support become dependence? Think of small moments. Eating without something to play suddenly feels uncomfortable. Walking without headphones feels strange. Falling asleep in silence becomes difficult. The urge to fill every empty space appears immediately. The background noise transitions from regulation into a subtle form of escape. The purpose of recognizing this is never to judge the avoidance. It is simply to pause and wonder, what exactly feels so dangerous about the quiet? Because underneath the need for constant input, there may be experiences waiting to be understood.
Learning to tolerate quiet doesn't mean forcing stillness. The nervous system rarely changes through pressure. Safety develops gradually. Imagine walking down a familiar neighborhood sidewalk on a cool Tuesday afternoon. Instead of reaching for the tangled headphones in your coat pocket, you simply leave them there. You walk for just 2 blocks, noticing the sound of tires rolling over the pavement and the wind shifting in the trees, allowing your mind to simply exist in the ambient, unstructured environment of the real world. At first, it may feel uncomfortable. Tolerance for a quiet mind cannot be forced through harsh discipline. The nervous system must be taught that stillness is safe through tiny, manageable increments. It is about practicing brief moments of unstructured reality, holding a warm mug of coffee in the morning light without a screen in your opposite hand, even just for 60 seconds.
Over time, These small, gentle exposures teach the body that the absence of stimulation is not a threat, then neutral. Eventually, sometimes surprisingly peaceful, because silence does not always arrive empty. Sometimes it arrives carrying something else, relief. Think of the way the ocean pulls back from the shoreline at low tide. When the heavy, crashing waves finally retreat, the beach itself does not disappear. It simply becomes visible again, revealing exactly what has been resting beneath the water all along. Unstructured silence operates in much the same way. When the continuous noise of our modern routines finally pulls back, what remains can sometimes feel deeply uncomfortable. It might reveal a quiet ache of loneliness. It might expose unfinished grief or half-formed thoughts that have been waiting for our attention.
But beneath years of accumulated noise, there is also something else. There is a version of you waiting, without demands, without expectations, and without urgency. Just unfamiliar because you haven't spent much time together. Perhaps silence isn't always emptiness. Perhaps sometimes it is recognition, the pause between. And learning to sit there, even briefly, may not mean losing comfort, only discovering what remains when nothing else is speaking. If this felt familiar, consider subscribing for more reflections on psychology, emotional patterns, and the quiet experiences people rarely talk about. There's space here whenever you want to return.